in setting the tone and maybe expectations for what's to come for the rest of the term. So we're really excited to be bringing this to you today. Your two main co-hosts are going to be myself and Rena Coughlin, our fearless leader at the Nonprofit Center, and Rena's going to introduce herself in a little bit. And a little bit about the Nonprofit Center. I'm not going to go too much into this because seeing who's on, I think almost everybody is a member or familiar with us, but we are a membership-based nonprofit organization, and we provide capacity building and support for other nonprofit organizations. What you see listed here is kind of a sampling of the resources and support that we provide to the sector, both to members and non-members in varying forms. Obviously, because of COVID, we've had to adjust how we provide services and what we prioritize. So if you see anything listed here, or you don't see anything listed and you're curious about it, again, any of the Nonprofit Center staff on this call would be happy to talk more about it with you. And if you just want to visit our website and you haven't yet, nonprofitctr.org, we have a lot of great resources on there. And obviously I have to do a quick plug of our other events coming up. We have our grants mini-series, Design, Measure, and Fund the Change You Seek, coming up on Thursday, May 6th from 9 a.m. to noon. We also have our Essentials around Fund Development on Tuesday, May 11th from 9 to 10:30 a.m. And then our Resilient 2021 Summit, which we just made public this week, I believe. Very, very exciting. If you want more information on that, definitely check out our website. I believe it's $25 for members and $50 for non-members. And the next event on the Jessie Advocacy series for this series is going to be on Thursday, June 24th from 9 to 11 a.m. And that one's going to be more of a workshop where we're going to be focusing on how do you actually build your advocacy platform? How do you build the capacity within your organization to prioritize advocacy and actually engage with it in a way that's going to be impactful for your organization and the communities that you serve? And the Jessie Advocacy series, as I mentioned, it's really it's a new series that we've introduced this year, but it's really an extension of a great partnership we've had with the Jessie for years now. And you all may be familiar with the Jessie as the Jessie DuPont Center. This is a type of program that we've done in the past when needed. So it's really great to be able to formalize this series a little bit more, especially during a year like the year we've had, where we know that having collective conversations and kind of having the opportunity to digest something and get to a mutual understanding can be really hard to do. So I really think that this series has taken on an additional significance this year with everyone being so siloed and disconnected. And of course, getting to work with the Jessie, which since its inception has always had a specific goal of being a place for conversation. It really felt like a natural extension of our partnership. And then obviously this work is informed by our Stronger Nonprofits framework, which is based on 4 pillars, which is high performing leadership teams, organizational learning and impact measurement, access to capital, and then the pillar that today's session would fall under is external awareness and advocacy. If anyone isn't familiar with our framework, we do have a whole page on it on our website where we dive into what these pillars mean. How do you know if you're doing well in one of these pillars? So we'll make sure to drop a link to that in the chat. And then just a review of today's agenda. We wanted to break up today's conversation in a way where we could get different perspectives and kind of different levels of overview. So we're going to have a federal landscape overview that's led by the Florida Nonprofit Alliance. We're then going to get a state perspective and kind of review the impacts on a state level from the Florida Policy Institute. And then we have an amazing panel of local leaders who are going to give us some insights on how all of these things impact local nonprofits and how do you actually, what does it mean to work in advocacy? So really excited about that. And then we're going to do an audience Q&A. So even though we do have a specific time for audience Q&A, you don't have to wait till then to put in your questions in the chat, especially if you don't understand something or you have a clarifying question. There are the folks that maybe don't understand also. So please feel free to put that in the chat and we'll try to answer some as we go along and then save some for the audience Q&A. But if there aren't any questions, I am going to pass it off to Rena.
Thanks, Isis. And welcome, everyone. I'm really glad to see so many folks interested in this topic. We did this in 2017 when President Trump was elected. And I think I heard the other day that as a candidate, Joe Biden issued something like 800 policy papers. And I think we've felt a little bit more at sea when President Trump was elected. I don't think he had anything near that sort of level of explicit policy papers available to us. But I think we're overwhelmed with information right now. I think there's an enormous amount of opportunity for us as a sector to really engage in something important. And I felt quite happy that the president decided to address the joint session of Congress just to explain what the topic for today is on Thursday night. So anyways, let's dive into what is a federal overview from the perspective of the first 100 days of the Biden administration. And to give us that overview, I'm very pleased to introduce Sabine Perwez, who's the executive director of the Florida Nonprofit Alliance. For those of you who are not members of the Florida Nonprofit Alliance, you're missing out. And I suggest you check out becoming a member. It's an organization created specifically for us, for the nonprofit sector, to help us advocate and learn about and have a voice as a statewide unit. There are nonprofit centers like the Nonprofit Center of Northeast Florida throughout Florida, but we did not have statewide representation. And Sabine and her small but mighty team that includes a terrific lobbyist are actually in the halls and making things happen for nonprofits every day. So please join the Nonprofit Alliance. Sabine is a natural in this position. She has held positions at Pace Center for Girls, the Florida Chamber of Commerce. She's done work in the Vital Global's partnership and in early childhood education in Cambodia. So she's well experienced in how the levers of government can be tugged in the favor of an important social objective. So with that, I'm going to ask Sabine, and particularly, I forgot to mention, she is a new member of the National Council of Nonprofits board. So she has an insider seat on the decision-making at that federal level advocacy organization for the sector. So with that, Sabine.
Thanks, Rena. Good morning, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us this morning. I'm going to cover a high-level overview of everything that's happened in DC over the past 100 days for President Biden's administration. As Rena mentioned, the Florida Nonprofit Alliance is the state's nonprofit state association, and we are looking to advance, promote, and strengthen the nonprofit sector. We just changed our mission through our strategic planning process, and our new mission is Florida Nonprofit Alliance is the state's collective voice, respected advocate, effective connector, and powerful mobilizer for the nonprofit sector. We're really excited about all the work that lies ahead and is coming down the pipeline, especially because we are familiar with what's happening in other states, courtesy of the 44 other state associations across the country. So anytime there are challenges or opportunities, we make sure we're talking to each other to uplift one another, but also to provide opportunities for being proactive and responsive when we need to resource share across the country. A lot of the news that we are sharing today, we share within our monthly newsletter and our updates to our subscribers. So if you are hesitant to become a member or just want to stay informed and not necessarily delve too deep into this work, I would highly encourage you to sign up just to stay informed at a low level so you can stay connected as well. So we're going to start first with the American Rescue Plan Act. If you recall, this passed back in March, which seems like ages ago. And this is a $1.88 trillion in federal investments to our nation. The bill provides urgent and targeted funding to defeat the coronavirus pandemic and provide workers and families the resources they need to survive the pandemic while making sure that the vaccine is being administered and distributed as safely as possible to as many Americans as possible. I'm going to review a couple of key components of the bill as it affects the nonprofit sector at large. So the first component is childcare. Childcare and Head Start received around $39 billion for childcare, including $24 billion for childcare stabilization grants, nearly $15 billion for the childcare and development block grants. States must use childcare stabilization funds to award subgrants to qualified childcare providers that are either open or temporarily closed to help support their operations during the pandemic. The childcare development block grants funds can be used flexibly by states, including for childcare subsidies. The plan gives states the authority to expand eligibility for childcare assistance to essential workers, regardless of their income threshold. The funds will expand childcare assistance to an estimated 875,000 children across the nation. The legislation also includes $1 billion for Head Start to ensure Head Start programs have the resources they need to continue safely providing services to children and families throughout the pandemic. Nutrition is another key component of this investment. The bill extends the 15% increase in SNAP benefits through September 30th, 2021 to address the hunger crisis. As many as 50 million Americans have struggled to feed themselves or their families during the pandemic and need this continued support to put food on the table. The bill will also extend the pandemic EBT program, which helps children in need by providing families who normally would receive school meals in person with the value of those missed school breakfasts and lunches. Another key component is emergency rental assistance. There's $25 billion allocated in emergency rental assistance provided in the December package that was given out. And this is essentially looking to scale that up. So the $57 billion that was given back in December is now getting an additional $25 billion because we know that the renters owed a lot more. The American Rescue Plan includes $21.55 billion in emergency rental assistance to augment funds provided to the states, localities, and territories in December. So if you've been watching local news, you've seen that the United Way has received that contract from the city of Jacksonville for that emergency rental assistance program, something that you are certainly welcome to share with your stakeholders and clients as well. Another key component is AmeriCorps. A lot of our local agencies do utilize this team of volunteers. And so the Corporation for National and Community Service includes $1 billion to support CNCS. Additional funding will position AmeriCorps to increase the number of national service participants while making immediate targeted investments to meet the priorities outlined in the Biden administration's COVID-19 response strategy, which includes helping schools safely open, tackling the growing hunger crisis, and helping communities across the nation address other challenges brought on by the pandemic. Something that recently opened, it was slated to open early April. There were some delays with this program's opening, but it is finally live and the applications are open, is the Shuttered Arts Venture Program. This program was established by the Economic Aid to Hard-Hit Small Businesses, Nonprofits, and Venues Act and amended by the American Rescue Plan Act. The program provides over $16 billion in grants to shuttered venues, and it's administered by the Small Business Association's Office of Disaster Assistance. So you do need to create a profile with the SBA, and the application is alive. You can go back and save and amend it, but those dollars are there and they are available to any entity that qualifies as an arts organization. The other piece that's important to mention is paid leave tax credits. The IRS issued a fact sheet this month explaining that the American Rescue Plan Act, under the American Rescue Plan Act, employers are entitled to refundable payroll tax credits for providing paid leave to employees who take time off related to COVID-19 vaccinations. One of the Biden administration priorities is to get as many people as possible vaccinated as quickly as possible. The tax credits are available to eligible employers that pay sick and family leave for them from April 1, 2021 through September 30th, 2021. The fact sheet provides helpful tips about which employers are eligible, the leave for which the tax credits can be claimed, the amount of the credits and how they're calculated and how to claim that credit. I've hyperlinked that fact sheet, so once Isis or Anna send this out afterwards, you can just click the link and access that. So now the stuff to watch. We saw this plan come out just this past Wednesday, and it's still very much a draft, literally 15 pages. The White House released the American Families Plan, and it's a $1.8 trillion proposal to provide free education, pre-K and community college, paid leave, family medical leave, subsidized childcare, and so much more. There's still a lot of details missing. This is seen as a companion to the hard infrastructure bill, and it's being discussed in DC as a soft human infrastructure bill. The plan would be paid for over 15 years through increased taxes on taxpayers earning more than $400,000 and an increase in capital gains tax rates for people earning more than $1 million. The plan calls for eliminating a stepped up basis, meaning heirs would be liable for taxes on gains in the value of inherited property above $1 million. This also includes the ones that they accrued before they took ownership. Notably, the plan states that taxes would be assessed on property donated to charity. There is no reference in the plan released so far to the proposal by the Biden administration to limit the value of itemized deductions to 28%. That is something we're still watching. The plan is also silent on changes to the estate tax or to the $10,000 cap on state and local taxes, also known as SALT. One or more of these may show up in the legislative text for the American Families Plan or any other legislation, so we are still watching that very carefully. The other piece that was released this week were the 2020 census numbers. For Florida, we did end up having a net gain of 1 seat. Many of us who were in the trenches with this work really were hoping for 2 seats, knowing the numbers that we know for the state as far as how many people are born and move into the state. The resident population did increase from 2010 from 18 million to 21. This means that Florida will get that 1 seat, and there will be a total of now 28 seats in the House. The average number of people in each of the 120 state House districts has also increased to 179,000, and the average number of people in each of the 40 state Senate districts has increased to 538,000. The Florida legislature is required to redraw legislative and congressional district boundaries using the block level population and demographic data. We will not have that available until September of this year. And at this time, the Florida House and Senate do believe that they will be able to meet their constitutional duty and complete redistricting work before the conclusion of the 2022 regular session. Both the House and the Senate did release a statement right after the census results came out. The last thing I want to mention, I think everybody on this call with the work Rena and her team have been doing knows about the PPP, but just in case you've been waiting, that money is going to run out by early next week, just knowing the numbers where they are. So if you've been waiting, please do fill out that last application and send it over. We worked really hard to get that extension, and we want to make sure nonprofits utilize that service that's provided. So with that, I'll turn it back over to Rena.
Thanks. I was quickly writing notes. Thank you so much, Sabine. I'm going to check in very quickly with Anna and see if there's any questions in the chat that we need to address before we move to the next. Okay. All right. Terrific. So the next person who's going to provide us with really expert information is Sudhaf Knight, who is the head of the Florida Policy Institute. This is another key organization that I'm gonna have to ask Sudhaf if we can become members, but I wholeheartedly support the work of the Florida Policy Institute. It came about almost at the same time as the Florida Nonprofit Alliance, when the nonprofit sector, as well as philanthropy and many other people, said there really isn't an independent research and policy institute to help influence and inform legislators. And I believe that's pretty much their core work. And Sudhaf has more than 15 years of experience in public policy and research and advocacy. And her areas of expertise include revenue, economic development, and community development policy. Prior to joining FPI, she was the Vice President, Policy and Research at Carolina Small Business Development Fund. So welcome to the state, welcome to the Florida Policy Institute, and thank you so much for being part of our program today, Sudhaf.
Thank you so much, and thanks everybody for joining us this morning. I'm happy to participate today. As Rena mentioned, I'm from Florida Policy Institute, and we don't have members, but you can certainly sign up for our newsletter, follow us on social media, and learn all about all the things that we're doing. Before I jump in, I want to share a little bit more about Florida Policy Institute, or FPI. We are a nonpartisan, nonprofit think tank that promotes state policies and budgets that improve the economic mobility and quality of life for all Floridians. And we achieve this primarily through thoughtful, objective analysis. And some of our primary research areas include education, healthcare, criminal justice, safety net issues, budget analysis, and tax policy. We have developed our vision for the future of Florida. We call it our Roadmap to Shared Prosperity. And this is our vision for how we can achieve economic opportunity for all Floridians and where we need to invest in order to get there. So we have 4 major principles. One is fostering community well-being by investing in education and health, spurring sustainable growth by promoting equitable development, investing in smart infrastructure and improving climate resilience, advancing shared prosperity by nurturing inclusive communities and building a strong safety net, and finally, modernizing and cleaning up our tax code for a stronger future. And you can find this on our website, floridapolicy.org/roadmap. I'm going to give a little bit of an overview of the American Rescue Plan Act and hopefully not duplicate things that Sabine already shared with us. As she mentioned, the Rescue Plan Act totals $1.9 trillion, making it one of the most expansive relief packages in US history. By comparison, in 2009, Congress passed the American Reinvestment and Recovery Act in response to the Great Recession, and that totaled $840 million. Much of the Rescue Plan Act is targeted to low and moderate income Americans, which are, the people who've really been impacted by COVID the most. This chart here shows sort of the biggest buckets of funding that are coming down to the state of Florida. The state will be receiving $10.2 billion in aid. Counties, cities, and other local governments and tribal nations will also be receiving a significant chunk of funding. There's an incentive for the state of Florida to expand its Medicaid program, and if it does that, it'll receive an additional $3.5 billion in funding, which would kind of be a cherry on top because Medicaid expansion already would lead to budget savings for the state. As Sabine mentioned, there's a significant chunk for childcare and a lot of funding for K-12 and higher education. The American Rescue Plan Act also included several provisions to assist individuals, and I won't go over all of these, but here's a sort of quick overview of all of them, or most of them at least, and the significant impact that it's going to have here in Florida and throughout the nation. It was estimated that the Rescue Plan Act would cut child poverty in half, so it really is a significant piece of legislation that was passed. Florida Policy Institute has been keeping an eye on the plan overall, but there's a particular area of it that we've really been focusing in on, and that's the $10.2 billion in state fiscal aid, and that's the part that I'm going to be focusing on today. So when we're looking at this money that's going directly to the state, it's important to think about some guiding principles for how this funding should be used in order to achieve the most benefits for the most Floridians and to help those who have been impacted the most. So again, first, oops, sorry, I didn't edit my slide, so it shouldn't say 4 allowable uses. These are 3 principles. One is to help those who have been most impacted by COVID-19. So families who are having trouble putting food on the table, paying their rent, people who are suffering from illness, depression, substance use disorder. Second is to mitigate the deep and persistent inequities that we have built into our economy. And third is to use these one-time investments to spur and sustain long-term change. So how can we use this funding to generate economic recovery in which truly all Floridians will benefit from the economic gains that we'll see? For this state fiscal aid, the bill outlines 4 allowable uses. One is to respond to COVID-19 and its economic impacts, and this can include assistance to households and small businesses and nonprofits. It can also include assistance for impacted industries like tourism, hospitality, and travel. It can be used to provide premium pay to essential workers, cover revenue losses from the previous year, and invest in broadband and other infrastructure. FPI put out some analysis on the ARPA provisions, and we also put out several recommendations for how we think the money could be used to spur an equitable economic recovery. And so under each of the buckets that are of allowable uses, we have several recommendations. So for responding to COVID-19, we suggested enacting a temporary working families tax rebate, which would be similar to a state level earned income tax credit, providing rent relief to small businesses, increasing funding and staffing for county health departments, which have seen significant cuts both in funding and capacity since 2010. And as we've seen over the past year, they're particularly important, especially during a public health emergency. Providing utilities relief for families who are facing shutoffs, and updating and fixing Florida's outdated Connect system, which is the system that is used to process unemployment claims. In terms of providing premium pay to essential workers, the state could provide a boost for Department of Corrections staff. This department has faced fiscal challenges for the past several years, and understaffing has been a huge issue. It can also provide one-time relief to childcare, K-12, and post-secondary employees, and also aid to workers in impacted industries like tourism and travel, which are essential for Florida's economy. In terms of covering revenue losses, there are several programs that have been historically underfunded in Florida, and this can be an opportunity to fully fund those programs, including the Sadowski Housing Trust Fund, environment and conservation programs, and mental health and substance use disorder treatment programs, which are typically funded through special projects and don't have recurring funding. And finally, in terms of infrastructure, as we've seen through the pandemic, the importance of people being able to be connected, being able to work and learn remotely. Money can be invested to expand broadband into all communities and reduce the digital divide, and also invest in water quality infrastructure. What has happened since ARPA was passed is that the legislature has agreed upon a budget for the upcoming fiscal year, which includes a plan for using the state fiscal aid dollars, and some of these things have actually been included in there. There is bonus payments for Department of Corrections staff, for K-12 employees, for childcare workers, and essential first responders and others. There is funding to modernize the Connect system. There's several investments in environment and water programs. And one thing that is not as a result of direct funding from ARPA, but was enabled by ARPA, is extending Medicaid postpartum coverage from to 1 year post-birth. The legislation provided an option for states to do that, and the state of Florida thankfully did take that up, and it's going to have a huge impact on mothers and babies throughout the state. So now I'm going to talk more about specifically Florida's budget for the upcoming fiscal year. And first, to just give you an overview of the budget at a glance, this is for the upcoming fiscal year 2021-22. If you look at our revenue sources, primarily we have 3 funding sources: general revenue, which is the money that is raised through sales tax mostly, corporate income taxes and other taxes; state trust funds, which are funds that are raised and are dedicated to fund specific programs or initiatives; and federal funds, which are the biggest chunk for this upcoming fiscal year, which is money that comes down from the federal government to support various programs. And not surprisingly, this year, that's a significant portion of our state budget. And if we look at how our total funding among all those revenue sources is split up between different sections of the budget, you'll see here that the biggest chunks of those funding sections are human services, which accounts for 44% of our total budget, and education, which accounts for 30%. And then the next biggest is natural resources, environment, growth management, and transportation, followed by the other sections of the budget. And I wanted to bring this to your attention because a lot of the funding that supports human services and education comes from federal dollars. So most of the federal dollars that we receive go to these two areas of our budget. So 65% of the federal funding goes to human services, and this includes our Agency for Health Management, Agency for Health, whatever it is, our health agency, including our Medicaid program, and then K through 12 higher ed, early education falls into the education bucket. So looking at how this upcoming budget fund allocates the ARPA funding, $4 billion of it is across these four buckets. $2 billion will be used for the state highway system, and this is for projects that were stalled or stopped because of COVID. $1 billion will be used for the governor to respond to emergencies and disasters. $500 million will be deposited into this new Florida Resilient Florida Trust Fund, which is grants for local governments and agencies to fight climate change, and then another $500 million into the water, these water programs. There are also other initiatives that are in the budget, and this is again just that $10.2 billion state fiscal aid portion. There's a whole bunch of other stuff in education and in healthcare, but this is just focusing on that $10.2 billion. $208 million for these bonus payments that I referenced. $125 million for a program that will distribute books to elementary grade students who are reading below their grade level. $56 million to upgrade that Connect system, which is the reemployment assistance system that I mentioned. And then $30 million for grants for facilities in Florida that highlight the contributions and history of African Americans in our state. Importantly, the budget leaves on the table $3.6 billion of our ARPA allocation for state fiscal aid. That $3.6 billion is being left as unallocated general revenue. But as I mentioned earlier, there's a lot that the state could do with that would really target aid to people who have been most impacted. And like I mentioned, the Working Families Tax Rebate, relief for small businesses, utilities relief for families. These are the kinds of things that would really have an impact on helping families not only get through this recession, but also be able to, achieve some sort of stability moving forward. Some of the restrictions around this funding include that the state cannot use these federal dollars to make up for any reductions in revenue. So any law, regulation, or administrative action that results in a reduction or a tax cut or revenue reduction is not allowed under this legislation. And if a state does have net tax reductions, it would have to forfeit those dollars and return an equivalent amount to the federal government. This provision is in place for as long as it takes for the state to use up the ARPA dollars or through the end of 2024. So some things to keep in mind as we think about Florida's budget and our revenue moving forward and our recovery, both to balance our budget and to remain in compliance with the with ARPA. One is that tourism has taken a substantial hit. Tourism is a significant part of Florida's economy, and although things are reopening, economists don't project that full tourism activity will return until at least 2024. Another consideration is that the legislature did pass a bill that would enforce sales tax collection for online purchases. However, that bill also stipulated that the revenue generated would be deposited into the Unemployment Compensation Trust Fund. And after that, it would be used to offset a reduction in the business rent tax. So essentially, the bill is revenue neutral. So we're not actually gaining any general revenue dollars from this bill that was passed. Third, we have a few sales tax holidays and a few more proposed that cost the state millions of dollars. And research has shown that these sales tax holidays don't actually provide the return to the state that they expect, and they end up costing more to the state than they provide in benefits. And finally, our economic recovery really does hinge on the swift and equitable distribution of the COVID-19 vaccine. Although I said that, as I mentioned, things are opening up, I think, a true return to life as whatever our new normal is going to be really does hinge on people being vaccinated and us achieving some level of immunity. So what is next in our state budget process? So as I mentioned, we're in this third bucket right here, this third bubble. The legislature has agreed upon a budget proposal for the upcoming fiscal year, and this is after negotiating between the differences between the House and the Senate. As early as lunchtime today, they'll be able to vote on this proposal, and then it'll head to the governor's desk where he will be able to review and provide submit any vetoes. And he has technically until basically June 30th to do this. Last year, he did wait until the very end of the fiscal year, but we'll see how it goes this year. And then the legislature may override any vetoes by a 2/3 vote. And after that, it becomes enacted into law. That was a very, very quick overview of our state budget, but here's my contact information and information for Florida Policy Institute. I'm happy to take any questions now, or if you think of any later, always welcome to reach out to us by email or on social media.
Awesome.
Thank you.
Thanks, Sudha. I really appreciate that. And Sabine, I'm going to check in with Isis and Anna and see if we have specific questions for either Sabine or Sadaf at this point. They're going to stay around to participate in the panel discussion as well and to take questions at the end. But do you see any, Anna or Isis? Okay. I do have a couple of quick questions. One of the things that Sabine, help me with what it's called. It's the White House Office on Partnership, I believe, and they're doing weekly calls. I listened to the call yesterday, and someone asked a question about the impact on the proposed tax code changes, particularly around capital gains and the taxes increases on the wealthy in terms of charitable giving. And I don't know whether that's something, I know you just finished conducting research on the impact of the 2017 and 18 changes on the tax code on giving in Florida. And is that something that you're watching at NCN and FNA?
Yeah, we are charitable giving, the deductions, both the pieces that both David Thompson at the National Council of Nonprofits is heavily working on. And the other piece that I didn't mention because it's not included right now is the Work Now Act, which is something the charitable sector heavily supports. And it's specifically looking at ensuring the nonprofit sector's viability and increasing charitable giving. And they don't have a Republican sponsor, so it's not bipartisan. And as a result, they're trying to get a bipartisan signer so that we can include it in this package. So yeah, absolutely working on it. There just hasn't been a definitive answer on it yet.
And for anyone interested, this White House Office of Partnerships, you can listen in on their calls. Just sign up and we'll send out the link. But their response was they think this will incent charitable giving because, as Sabine put in her slides, that gifts that are passed on through property that's passed on is still deductible. So I think, we'll just have to wait and see.
And I'm glad you mentioned it, Irina,
yeah.
because the White House Office of Public Engagement has actually been very open, and they've asked for nonprofit leaders, they're asking for faith leaders, and they try to do calls specific to each niche, and that's new. And we are hoping those lines of communications also stay open.
Yeah, yeah. I did nod off a little at the end of yesterday's when the IRS was talking, but I really, they're good. Sadaf, I wanted to ask you about the Medicaid expansion. And to me, it's really indicative of where we could see great things happening at the federal level that the state decides not so much, right? Because we are looking at a Democratic president and a Republican governor and legislature. And Medicaid expansion to me was one of the great examples of a political barrier to good policy after the Affordable Care Act was passed. So you mentioned that there's incentives in the rescue plan. Did the legislature choose to ignore those incentives again this year?
Yes, so the Rescue Plan Act provides an additional federal match for states who have not expanded their Medicaid programs for 2 years. And we can take up this option anytime. Like, there's no time limit on when Florida has to expand Medicaid in order to take up this option. And as I mentioned in my presentation, that's an additional $3.5 billion, which is enormous. And already without that incentive, Medicaid expansion would lead to like $200 million in budget savings for the state. So that's pretty significant. The only thing that they took up was the postpartum extension, but they have not elected to expand our Medicaid program.
And that brings up my final question for both of you all before we move to our panel. I want to talk about, sort of your diagram that shows how much of the federal budget is or the state budget is pass-through dollars from the federal level. And I can see on my screen, I'm looking at Faye, and I know Faye is trying to lobby at the federal level, at the state level, and at the local level, because those pass-through dollars are so she has to influence every level to finally get that down into to make an impact at the local level. How is it that you all would recommend the folks that are here on the call today, how is it that we can effectively influence, at any level, how those dollars, like, the Medicaid dollars, how is it that we change someone's mind about expanding Medicaid? How is it that we change or make sure that what's happening way far away in DC actually ends up making an impact here in Northeast Florida? And I know that's a very hard question, but I'm also thinking about a setup for the how we can become active in coalitions, how we can be active, how we can expand our voices. So that's like a big bad question to end on. Yeah.
It is very difficult, but there are opportunities. I mean, I'll just say, unfortunately, with the CARES Act and the American Rescue Plan Act, it's been very difficult to influence how those dollars are spent in Florida. And there has not been opportunity for advocates or families or individuals to influence how those funds were allocated. But I will say that, as you mentioned, there are coalitions who are working on issues. If you're, interested in them, or your organization has one of those issues as a priority, I would recommend, joining a coalition. Florida Policy Institute, if you go to that website I told you about, floridapolicy.org/roadmap, we have an advocacy toolkit, which kind of goes through how you can engage your local legislators who represents you at our state legislature, and how to do that, because it is really important that, even though it's a very difficult climate and it's very challenging to influence legislators right now, I think it's still important to try to make your voice be heard. So I think you're always welcome to, I think, reach out to your legislator, but also connecting with other advocates and organizations that are working on these issues is also another way to go about that.
Yeah, and I would only add, I mean, Medicaid is a whole different conversation just because of politics, but outside of that, knowing your bottom line is really helpful. So data is extremely important. Making an economic value add is extremely important. Human stories alone are just not enough. They have to make it translate for how it will positively impact your district. And so we've seen a translation of our research allowing us to do that. So having COVID research from last year to show how the sector was affected really did allow us to advocate positively for why the PPP needs to be extended, how those dollars would be used, what are the tangible ways in which the sector would utilize those dollars. Having those numbers was extremely helpful for elected officials that aren't working just along party lines, but are really looking for common sense solutions. And so having an impact of numbers on your organization is helpful. And I always, having worked at PAYS, I love how they just have that number really quickly of this is how much we're saving you. That's helpful because they do listen, even if it seems like they might not respond, they do pay attention to bottom line as far as dollars are concerned in their districts.
Great. And before I turn it over to Isis to segue to the next part of our program, I do want to ask, I'm looking at people that I know work hard in policy change every day. Would you, if you were a part of a coalition or an association that you want to invite others to or let them know is working on issues, would you please put that in the chat? For instance, I am sure that there's, Tyler, there's got to be associations and coalitions that are working to help the disabled community have a stronger voice. Shannon, I know your work, there's coalitions, local, state, and federal. So if you all have coalitions that you're part of that you think would be, whether it's just, Alexia's on the call and there's the, girls and women's local coalition, those sorts of things are really important for all of us to connect through and grow our power through. So with that, I'm going to thank Sabina and Suduf again, and then ask or invite Isis to take us to the next part.
Thank you for that information. I'm really excited to introduce our panel of nonprofit leaders. So I want to jump right in. So I'm going to introduce everyone. So we have Faye Johnson, who is the Chief Executive Officer for Northeast Florida Healthy Start Coalition. Tyler Morris, who is the Executive Director for Center for Independent Living Jacksonville. And Shannon Blankenship, who is the Chair for Resilient Jacks, and I know among many hats too. So I want to thank you all for being here, and thank you for agreeing to just share about how the past 100 days and also looking forward is really impacting your organization. So Faye, I want to kick off with you if that's okay. I think we've heard a lot, in the past, hour of issues that are directly impacting the work that you do. So I don't know if you mind sharing a little bit more about what those issues are and how it's impacting the organization, maybe how your organization is reacting to that.
Sure. And first, I want to thank you all and thank the Nonprofit Center for asking me to join this panel. It's exciting and the information is awesome. I learned so much. I should have taken a lot of notes, but I'm going to have to go back on this. But I think for us, the plan has definitely emphasized the need to expand Medicaid, as we've heard before. One of the things that we focused on this legislative session to include 32 other coalitions across the state as strong advocacy. We have a Florida Association of Healthy Start Coalitions, was the expansion of Medicaid postpartum, because we know that that was needed currently. The original policy only expanded Medicaid for women that delivered 60 days postpartum. The House came back with an offer of 12 months. The Senate came back with 6 months. So there was some negotiation and we just went back and forth, but we held strong with our advocacy work across the state, and we were successful with the legislators expanding postpartum Medicaid to a full year. And that is so important because once a woman has her baby and everything, after 60 days, she still needs other care, you know, and family planning and all those kinds of things. So as we look at infant mortality, this is one of the main areas that we focused on that came out of the plan. And we were really glad to see also included is the expansion of Medicaid overall, because we know currently right now, women that are able to receive preventive care prior to pregnancy have much healthier outcomes. If you have chronic disease and things like that before pregnancy and you aren't able to address it because you don't have insurance, then your outcome of that birth outcome could be poor. So we have really looked at the plan in a lot of different ways. It's a really good plan, I would say, for the community in a lot of different areas, not only around healthcare for us, but the social determinants of health impact birth outcomes. So when you think about housing issues, paid leave, all those kinds of things really drive the health outcomes in our communities. So we have really been focused on quite a bit of this and watching just the vibe and working with legislators and how you go about the advocacy work at the federal level, state level, and then also our local city level. So those are some of the things we've really focused on once the plan came out, even before it came out, to be actually honest with you, because you know advocacy starts long before the session begins. So that's sort of what we focused on.
Yeah, thank you, Faye. Thank you so much for your tireless work. That's amazing at all levels. And I want to open the question to Tyler and Shannon as well, around any kind of movement or policy changes in the past 100 days that you see kind of directly impacting the work that you do.
I'll start. You know, one thing that I've been curious about, you know, how he was going to do this. We know the climate is, you know, was talked about heavily on the campaign trail, but climate is not one thing. And so how was he going to kind of, you know, interplay all the various things that need to be done within the different sectors? And so I was really, you know, optimistic when I saw that, you know, it's about jobs and it's about transportation and infrastructure and education and agriculture and everything, because, you know, climate alone, right, can be very polarizing. But when we think about it in terms of jobs and infrastructure and moving into the future, you know, we see how critical it is. So it'll go into some, you know, what I talk about a little bit more, but that is where I was really curious if it was going to be a big giant climate plan or if it was going to be integrated into everything that we do. And I love seeing that it was integrated in the way that it was.
And I'd add to that, one of the things that we were monitoring, you know, ever since the murder of George Floyd, our network has come together to talk about equity, diversity, and intersectionality. And so we were very deep in the trenches of going deep, of looking at policies and procedures of our SIL network, how we could expand services to our underserved areas and different racial minority groups within disability. And I think, you know, especially if you're receiving federal funds, you were very aware in the last administration, that executive order that definitely put some pause on some of that progress that was happening. And, you know, I was very pleased to see that that was one of the first 15 executive orders that were signed in that first day in office of expanding that, because it definitely allows us to do some meaningful work in our community.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for bringing that up, Tyler, because I think that's something I was thinking about, Faye and Shannon, as you were talking too, is, you know, the role that racial equity plays in all of this, right? Especially, you know, Faye, as you were talking about, you know, mothers and infant mortality. So thank you for bringing that up, Tyler. And I'm going to have another question on that later. So that's great. And I actually want to pose the next question to you, Tyler. So obviously we know with how quickly politics change, it can be kind of impossible to forecast or you know, kind of know what's coming in the horizon. But is there anything beyond the 100 days, whether it's potential policy or conversation that you've seen that you see impacting your organization, or that you kind of already put a pin in and say, we need to keep track of this and keep, see where this is going?
Yeah, and I think that Faye and Shane would agree that a lot of these issues exist regardless of which administration is in office. It's just the approach from federal guidance on how it is. One of those things has been healthcare access, and yes, Medicaid expansion. Making sure our care providers receive pay, expansion of community-based services for people with disabilities and the elderly. To answer your question, I think that health is going to continue, especially with vaccine access. Our group was hard hit with the guidance on who had access regarding disability. And there were a lot of things that had to happen for people with disabilities to get access to the vaccine. A form was created that needed to be signed by healthcare providers, making them eligible for disability to receive the vaccine. It was a barrier for folks who did not have primary care providers, were not able to leave their house to receive the vaccine, or were not able to afford transportation or even the doctor's appointment to get that signature. So we're watching that, so there might be a push for things like vaccine access. But like you said, when it hits that state level, how is it going to be, how is it going to roll out? So we did a lot of advocacy on the front end, making sure that there wasn't discrimination on resources for people with disabilities when there was a heightened, where everybody was afraid basically on the capacity for hospitals, and making sure that they had equitable access to those resources. And I think that that's going to continue past the 100 days as well.
Well, thank you. Yeah. And I want to pose that question to Shannon and Faye as well. And Shannon, you particularly, I'm curious of your take on infrastructure. You mentioned infrastructure and the definitions for infrastructure and all the conversation that's been around that expanding definition. And so I'm curious of how you're kind of tracking that, or where you see that going.
Sure. So Resilient Jacks is a coalition of local nonprofits. And again, we're focusing very locally. But what that means is, we're seeing all of this happening at the federal level. How are we, locally leveraging ourselves to take advantage of all that's going on federally? Because we know that, unlike the federal government here in Jacksonville, we are trying to sort of pigeonhole the conversation into person, the chief resiliency officer, which should be hired in the next few months, or into one department right now, the planning department. It is not a part of transportation and education and infrastructure. So are we really equipped and ready to bring in these federal dollars to help us grow and build? And are we working together to make sure that it's not just an infrastructure project like, a water pipe, but really thinking about, as sea levels rise, what do we need to do? Is housing needs to shift? Where are we going to build other additional housing? And really trying to bring, everyone together to make sure that we are ready and eager to accept this funding for projects that, we just needed the money and now we can execute. And I haven't seen that locally. I don't think that we are ready to do that. And so, that's a part of what we will be watching for and hoping to see, but continuing to advocate for more of that, that leadership, that comprehensive leadership.
Such a great point, Shannon. Thank you. Thank you for bringing that up, kind of being ready for when that opportunity comes. Faye, and I want to obviously pose that question to you as well, if there's anything in the horizon.
Sure. I think the previous speaker, Shannon, is correct. I don't think we're quite ready yet. Who's mobilizing and pulling all of us together as we watch the plan for a while? You often hear, well, there's so much money coming down. There's so much money coming down. What does that really mean? Who's organizing that to make sure that we are intentional in doing what we do? How do we come together as a group Because like I said, infant mortality spreads across everything. There's housing, transportation, jobs, childcare, all of it. So how do we bring that together to impact what's going on in our community? And watching different things, even with us in our coalition, we're saying, okay, there's so much in this plan. We knew where our one focus area would definitely be, and that was around Medicaid expansion, because we have to get our women healthier before pregnancy. But those other areas, how do we join in with those around the tax credit, pay, all those kinds of things, infrastructure, jobs? So I think there's a real opportunity, but we need to act now and not wait and try to figure out how are we going to grab everybody together to get this as much, how should I say, from the federal level to the community, because that's what it's about at the end of the day. It's about the community. So how do we really bring this home from the community? And I don't think we quite figured that out.
Yeah, no, thank you, Faye. And I want to mention too that I think your audio may be a little coming in and out, a little interesting. So I don't know if you're, I don't know if you mind muting and unmuting again, just to make sure that it's working.
Can you hear me now?
No, it's still got a little interesting like sound effects going on.
Maybe the traffic outside the window. I tried to move, so just keep going. I'll figure it out.
Awesome. And it might help to turn off the video if it's an internet thing. So just a heads up. But I think we were all able to hear your answer. So thank you. And Shannon, I have a question for you. Obviously with you wearing, as I mentioned earlier, a ton of different hats. And I think you have experience with a lot of different levels of advocacy structure and different types of advocacy work. I'm curious if you can give us some insight on what does it mean to focus on advocacy for your organization, right? What does working on advocacy mean for your organization? How does that translate to actual tangible work and kind of infrastructure for your organization?
Sure. So this is actually a pretty big sort of like foundation level question for any organization, right? Because, for example, the Miami Climate Alliance, we brought in very early in the Resilient Jacks sort of figuring out who we are. And they are very much boots on the ground, going door to door, finding out what people need, delivering services and being there. And that may be a place that we can get to in the future. But for right now, as an advocacy organization, what it means is that we are, constantly trying to get the message across of what we should be striving to see, the policies that would be helping us, the free things we could be doing right now, right, to reduce our impact and work together again in a more coordinated fashion, because resiliency is about parks and public works and planning and education. Like everybody needs to come together and come up with these solutions comprehensively. And so as an advocacy organization working to try to push that message, it doesn't matter when the storm is coming, when hurricane season is happening. We, as Faye said, this is year round, right? Talking about what we need to be doing, what we could be doing. And when you're talking about advancing policy, you always have to be pushing that message so that you hope that at the right time, right, when maybe a hurricane does hit, or when something, happens that triggers this sort of, community energy around this. Like why weren't we in the place to be able to get these millions of dollars for infrastructure improvements, because we know that sea level rise is coming and we are going underwater, right? Why weren't we ready for that? And so the advocacy work means always trying to be pushing the message and the agenda of preparedness and preparation before disaster hits, hoping that when disaster does hit, we are better off than we would have been without all of that advocacy work in the foreground.
Yes, thank you. And I'm hearing too, like just intersectionality and having an understanding of where there is intersectionality, and not, again, to your point, not just in times of crisis, but throughout the year. Tyler and Faye, obviously, love to open up the question to y'all as well.
Well, I'll go ahead and start. And I do think that Shannon brings up a really good point of advocacy does not stop. It just looks different at different points, right? So I do think that that's a really good point. As a Center for Independent Living, we're an agency, a nonprofit agency that's run by and for people with disabilities. We were chartered under the Rehabilitation Act of 1973. And as such, 51% of our board and staff have a disability. And Jackson, or required to. Jacksonville, here we're about at 60. So that allows a lot of, like Shannon was talking about, a core foundation to key issues, a lot of lived experiences, making sure that we're going in the right direction. So that's been very helpful for us in addressing those advocacy issues. For us, in advocacy is an approach of self-advocacy and systems advocacy. Self-advocacy is providing those tools and resources for people to, fight for their own rights. Systems advocacy looks at change at, local, federal, state levels for things that are inclusive of diversity in all its many forms when making decisions on things from, curb cuts to the weight of a door in a federal building. So that's our approach.
No, thank you. And obviously, I want to pose the question to Faye, but also Sabine and Sadaf, with you working in different structures that really hyper focus on advocacy, I'd love anyone to answer the question as well.
Yeah, I think something that Tyler just said resonated with me. I think it's important to remember that sometimes it might feel like self-advocating on behalf of an organization is the best route, but it's also important to advocate together as a coalition, whether it's within independent living, whether it's health, whether it's housing, but also as a sector, because sometimes divide and conquer hurts us more than helps us. And so to ensure that both our elected officials and agencies know that we're all talking to each other, that we're all advocates and sponsors of one another as well, shows that they can't essentially pit us against one another. So this is why coalition efforts are really critical. Something we're exploring is how do we leverage that at the state level with a specific nonprofit advocacy component, as opposed to only having a children's week or only having a day for PACE girls or only having a day for refugees, because it doesn't show the full entire impact of the sector. And that's something we're open to learning more about from you all and discussing in depth. The other piece I'd also add is we really need to also think about how our state is reflected. We're probably in the toddlerhood state as far as advocacy is concerned, compared to some of the other larger states that have stronger coalitions and stronger understanding of advocacy. Sometimes our boards don't understand why we need to enter the space. Sometimes our funders don't understand why we need to enter the space. So if we can also do the internal work of making sure they understand why, so that all of us as leaders of these organizations have the green light to go and do it. I've seen a lot of apprehension with staff because they know that they have to tippy toe around it. So if we could have greater communication and discussions on this, I think the sector would expand and grow significantly.
Absolutely. Yes to all of that. That I saw Amanda in the chat saying love that, and I also love that idea too. The concept of that we've heard a few times, the nonprofit Hunger Games, right? Of not falling into that trap. And obviously Faye and Sadaf, if there's anything else that y'all would love to add to that.
I would just add that I hope you guys can hear me better. I moved away from the traffic sound in the background. Moving today. But I think, you heard the old adage, or as there's strength in numbers. Believe that. Because there we have 33 coalitions, Healthy Start coalitions across the state. And when we come together, one issue, one topic, and all across the state like that, one message, advocacy message, the content is the same, you hear the same thing, you pound, it makes a difference. So when you have coalitions banding together, and the nonprofit sector banding together around one issue, that is so strong and powerful. Especially like you said, if you back it up with data, you back it up with return on investment and all those kinds of things. That's very, very important, and we encourage that. Yeah. We've seen some things changing behind that quite a bit.
No, thank you, Faye. It's hard because we're still having a hard time hearing you, but it sounds like what you're saying is amazing too. So I don't know if you'd want to try calling in, but I think we can hear what you're saying, and thank you.
Okay. I'll talk.
I just wanted to piggyback on those last two comments too, and what Tyler said about advocacy isn't just during our legislative session. It really is something that's all the time. And what you're doing in different times of the year might be different, but it's something that, you really, to be effective, can't just think about it during session. It happens all year round. And I think there is a lot of work that needs to be done in Florida for all of us nonprofits to kind of coordinate better. And I think one of the things that would be helpful is also being clear about what your expertise is in your organization, what your capacity is, and what level you're willing to support or hang back or take a lead on something. I think a lot of times we get issues or bad feelings or conflicting messaging when there's not clarity around that. And I think one thing that we do really intentionally is think about, well, how are we engaging on an issue? Are we the lead person, the lead organization? Are we supporting in coalition? In the coalition, what's our role? And is it helpful? Does it add value? And then who else is leading on it? And how can we support them rather than, we don't have to be the person up front all the time. And there's different ways you can support. There's, speaking to legislators, there's, sharing stuff on social media, there's, writing letters to the editor, op-eds, there's different ways you can engage. And I think if we can all be more coordinated and have some clarity on that, it would go a long way toward having cohesion and sort of a unified front, so to speak.
Yeah, and Isis, can I just jump in for a second? I think that a lot of us have, I was talking to an exec the other day and said, I can't be asked to do one more thing. And so sometimes getting involved in advocacy and policy sounds like that one more thing. And when there isn't necessarily, I mean, I'm thrilled that Faye can actually say, we moved the bar on postpartum Medicaid, that doesn't happen very often, that you actually can check the box and say this happened, because it is a cumulative and sometimes incremental process to change policy. So it's also hard to have that, metric at the end of your year that says this is what was successful. So I would just say again, that particularly for organizations that aren't part of a national, body, like Sarah Alford's on the call, and Sarah's part of Big Brothers Big Sisters, but she also participates in local and state coalitions. But if you don't have that sort of infrastructure, it's more important than ever to find your people if you're functioning on your own, and find your voice and have it multiplied and the power multiplied by joining together. And so I think, again, please put your coalitions, your meetings, your support groups, whatever it is that you work together in the chat. Let's all help each other find those support solutions. And then Sabine, if you want to, we will organize the North Florida meeting for planning a sort of a statewide nonprofit impact day in Tallahassee, or maybe it's a year, the nonprofit year.
I expect nothing less from you, so yeah. Let's
Awesome. Well, I think that's a perfect note to move on to our audience Q&A. I want to say a huge thank you to our entire panel for your expertise, for your honesty, and for sharing your experiences with us, and to please stick around for the audience Q&A, of course. So I think we have a few questions definitely to kick us off. And Tyler, it goes back to your comment around the executive order that was rolled back. earlier this year. I think we saw a lot of momentum last year around folks engaging in racial and gender-based equity trainings. Now with this executive order being rolled back and kind of the door being opened again, do you all see any sustained momentum in organizations not only engaging in racial equity trainings and learnings and capacity buildings, but building it into their infrastructure? So are you seeing any momentum? Are you seeing it sustained?
I'm happy to start with, we're seeing it as a barrier to entry, with so many people want to engage in this work that they are now essentially tapped out of budget to access these resources, because trainings for DEI trainers have doubled or tripled in cost, and the calendaring out is 6-8 months out. And so a lot of our members are reaching out and saying, how do we access this work? We have every intention to do the right thing, but we don't have the funding to, or the calendar accessibility to start this right away. And so they're looking for bite-sized ways to bring their staff, their board along, so that when that training does happen, they're moving along in the right direction. But everyone wants to do it, and I think everyone's at different places. It's important to recognize that that one training or that one course is not going to be the end all.
And I agree wholeheartedly with what Sabine's saying. I mean, there's through this, that we all have been responding to different things, leaves us at different ways of where we're addressing things that are systemic. As a network, we continued work in a different strategy. So we were ready when that executive order was lifted, and we're lucky to receive funding through Mayo Clinic's Everybody in Fund for Change, and we had town hall discussions in all of our 5 counties on seeing how that intersectionality of disability and another minority group impacts things like health, employment, transportation. So we were ready for that. So to answer your question, Isis, I think Sabine was spot on. I don't know if I need to add anything. Is that the bite-sized things, making it consumable, and to Rena's point, things like this and Nonprofit Center getting all of our nonprofits together hopefully is going to provide more connections, that if we do have funding, whether it be through CARES Act or a different funding federally, that others might be able to join that training. When it gets down to more specialized, executive leadership team and reviewing strategies and policies, that might be more specialized for different nonprofits. But I think it's important to share those opportunities to have cross-training between organizations.
Love that, thank you. And yeah,
Isis, I have a question from the chat. Going back to sort of how all of these new investments that are coming out, is there any way of sort of benchmarking where we are now and where we are at the end of the American Rescue Plan, so that we can build a case for continued investment, for instance, the extension of the SNAP benefits and Head Start and all these other things that are in the American Family Plan or in the Jobs Plan?
I can speak to that a little bit. We do a lot of trying to benchmark where we are. It's a little depressing because pretty much Florida is at the bottom of the barrel for so many metrics. And we're constantly trying to make the case that making investments in communities is actually beneficial for everybody, more so than tax cuts to corporations. I think that's an ongoing thing. I'm sure there will be a lot coming out after the end of this American Rescue Plan Act period and throughout it about the impact it's had. We probably will be putting stuff out, but our national partners, the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities, do a lot of this work as well in terms of tracking the impact, tracking both the impact of COVID and economic trends, or however you want to call it, but also looking at the impact of these big legislations that have impact on communities and individuals and families. So hopefully we can move the needle a little bit, but we're in it for the long haul, so we'll hopefully see that someday. But I don't have hope for the next year or two, to be honest.
Faye, you all must be looking hard at. There's so many expanded benefits for families and children. Is that something? You guys must have a ton of data on that.
Sure. And can you hear me now?
Perfect.
Yes, finally. Thank you. We do. We are tracking quite a bit of data on, especially around the insurance piece, the child tax credit, all those things that impact it. Like she said, though, we're not there yet. You know, we have a ways to go. Florida is where it is. But I will say that we're strongly encouraged in what we see. And if we pull together as a community and as leadership, we can make a dent in some of it. Maybe small, but a dent. And we have to keep pushing on that. That's my philosophy, and we have to. But for us at the coalition level, yes, we're tracking quite a bit of data in all these areas because, you know, someone will say, well, you all just, you know, are concerned about health, but the community is the health. It's all those things that are driving health. So we have to look at all of it. So yes.
Thank you, Faye. And I think we have time for one more question. Rena, I don't know if you have anything, or Anna, if you have anything. I got one in the chat that I can ask, and this is more of a state level question, but how do you expect the bill regarding, quote, protest and riots and monuments that was recently signed by Governor DeSantis to influence the ability to engage communities and advocacy in getting their voices heard? And obviously, I'd love to open this up to anyone else in the audience that maybe has some insight on this as well.
I'm happy to start. I think that bill is looking at more so large public gatherings and protests, and really just showing the First Amendment, you know, slight threat to, you know, don't show up because then you might get arrested, et cetera. But I think for advocacy for nonprofits in general, we usually don't protest in that capacity. Whether our organizations and employees choose to do so, that's a different conversation. So I don't know if it's going to scale back how individual organizations are connecting with elected officials and really advocating for their missions. But it will change how grassroots organizations are coming together, like New Florida Majority, on what issues they're advocating for with the greater public. I think there's two different ways I would look at that. The other bill that we haven't talked about yet that I think is important to just follow is the quasi-public entities bill for any organization that receives state funding, because as a result of the backlash from the Florida Coalition Against Domestic Violence, there are going to be, if it gets signed, there will be structural changes as to what is required to meet the compliance standards. And so that's going to be new, and we'll share that out with Rena as it comes out.
Thank you, Sabine. Before we close out, any other thoughts or comments?
Well, I'm just thinking that maybe we can all get arrested on Nonprofit Day at the Capitol. All
right, we're not going to let Rena plan that one.
I have a final point I would love to make with everyone on the call. You know, as we saw from the first 100 days, climate, same with, you know, the discussion around injustice and inclusion. It's not one line item, right, in like our bylaws or something that, you know, we talk about. It really needs to be fully integrated into our work. And I struggle to find any nonprofit organization that cannot, you know, justify wanting to see more resiliency, focus, and coming together and coalition building. So not that I'm trying to plug Resilient Jacks, but I do think about that, because there's tons of new funding sources for this work if you can integrate it into your mission and what you're doing. And I'd encourage everyone to do it, because the city of Jacksonville is not doing it right. So we need to do it and take advantage of that. But if you are curious about, you know, how some of these things might work with other organizations, then definitely become a member of Resilient Jacks, and, you know, bring all of us together to talk about, you know, how we all have a stake in the game when it comes to becoming more resilient in the face of climate change in the future.
Shannon, I couldn't have planned that better. That was going to be kind of one of my final questions.
Okay.
So I plugged into the chat real quick, just a survey for today's event. If before everyone logs off, if you don't mind just clicking on that and letting us know about today's event. But I wanted to end with both the panel as well as any attendees, anything that either you're engaged in right now that you'd love to let folks know about, or anything that's coming up that or around any of the issues that we've talked about that you just want to let other folks know about and get engaged in. I'd love to just open the floor for folks. And just go off mute if you want to.
I can start. If anyone is interested in following the state budget as it moves through the legislature, we put out reports on that. Our next report is going to be on the budget after vetoes. It's a monster of a report, but we're trying to make it easy to navigate. So if you're interested in education, for example, you can skip to that part. But if you are interested, join our newsletter. We only email things out once a month, so we don't spam you all. Yeah, just stay in touch on social media as well.
Thanks. And I would just like to add before we go off, there's the Florida Justice Project, and they were very instrumental also as an advocacy group around the postpartum expansion. So I would say check their website out as well and continue forward.
Beautiful. And I'm keeping track of what's being mentioned to send out to folks afterwards. Tyler?
I would add that self-advocacy training continues. We have a monthly peer-to-peer group for folks with disabilities. And if you'd like to continue a conversation on bringing those tools to the people you serve, because at the end of the day, it's their voices that matter most. So if you would like to be a part of that conversation, I'd be happy to connect.
Thank you. And I'm seeing some great stuff being shared in the chat. Kind of final call on anyone that wants to say anything? All right. Well, in that case, I just want to say thank you to everyone again for joining us. And we'll be sharing out not only the presentation, the recording, but as well as kind of a lot of the stuff that was mentioned in between out in an email afterwards. But thank you again for your time. Don't forget to take the survey and have a great rest of your weekend.